Hello and welcome back to another rousing episode of Cooking with Broke Millennials. If you recall from last week, we discussed how you can actually invest your avocado toast into housing and why American avocados are actually just lies wrapped in green skin. Today, we're going to be taking a look at one of the most important food groups for millennials, beer. Now, we aren't just talking about regular beer, we're going to be talking about how you can actually brew it yourself, and because this is for millennials, we have to make sure it's not just lazy and effortless, it does most of the cleaning for you too. So for that, we have the Pico C. So unlike the traditional homebrewing process, which can actually be done in a few ways, and I'm sorry, but Mr. Beer doesn't count, cleaning is usually one of the more obnoxious parts of the beer brewing process. That being said, typically you have stuff like this, which is Star Sand. You fill up your 5 to 10 gallon bucket, which will eventually contain your beer wort, and you stick every tool that you're going to be using in there, and then maybe a little bit of extra stuff too. And along the way, you're probably going to be a little bit intoxicated and only getting a lot more drunk. Just keep in mind, getting drunk is an important factor as you're brewing beer. So, how easy is it to actually clean and prepare the Pico C before brewing? It's as simple as turning your knob. Hit Utilities, go to Rinse, and then all we have to do is fill this up with water, connect it to a keg, it'll do a little rinse out system, and then you're ready to put the ingredients in and start brewing. Now that we've rinsed out the machine, it's time to brew some beer. And by brew some beer, I mean it's gonna brew some beer, and I'm gonna go over there and drink some beer instead. So let's maybe pretend that intro didn't just happen. We can blame it on something, I just don't know what. My name's Elliot, this is Pugloaf, and today we are obviously talking about the Pico C. The Pico C is PicoBrew's latest device and another Kickstarter success. With just about $2 million in fundings from backers, this is now PicoBrew's most affordable and smallest device that allows you to almost entirely automate your homebrewing process. Now you might wonder, especially if you've already homebrewed anything in the past, that the process shouldn't necessarily be automated, as it's kind of a hobby, something that you get your hands dirty with, and it's both a science and an art. So why would you want to automate that? Well, there's quite a few reasons for that, but we'll be digging into that in just a few minutes. That being said, let's actually take a quick look at what this has to offer and what you're getting for the $560 that's currently listed on here. Although to say, around the holidays right now, it's listed at $450, which is a much better price. The Pico C is sort of like a hybrid between a Keurig and a brewery that you can place somewhere in your home. For most of us, that's probably going to be in your kitchen, and as far as counter space, it takes up at about as much room of a microwave. It's a little bit taller than that, and it also does not quite include the spacing that's required for the keg and the serving keg. That being said, it's really a pretty small device. Now when it comes to homebrewing, there's all sorts of different shapes and sizes, especially for when it comes to yield and how much brew you're going to be producing. For this particular device, you're going to be brewing about 5 liters at a time, and for the actual brewing time, it takes anywhere from about 2 to 3 weeks, depending if you're either bottle conditioning or force carbing the beer. One of the interesting features that are tied to the Pico C is that, unlike other devices that allow you to automate it, this really kind of appeals to people who are in craft beer deserts. Now, with how the market has been, there's basically a brewery that pops up every other couple of months, but there are in fact craft beer deserts. That being said, this actually taps into those local small microbreweries and larger breweries and uses their recipes as part of the automated process. So really all you have to do is go to PicoBrew, find a brewery that you are familiar with, maybe you just find that it's interesting, you buy the Pico pack, and the machine almost entirely automates it after about 10 minutes of hand-on work. So if you've ever homebrewed in the past, you know that there's plenty of different recipes that are currently available that are either in extract or in all grain form. You can go onto a site like Northern Brewer, they have tons of different recipes, they'll send you the kit and you brew it. That's a really common way to actually get involved. So like that, Pico C allows you to do that. However, as you get more advanced, typically that's where you start to customize your recipe. You'll start building out, you'll change the mash temperature, you'll adjust the boil times, and of course play with different yeast types. With the Pico C, you do get some of that, but it is a little bit limited. I'd almost say it's like they put a purposeful governor on it, which is my only true gripe with this device. But that being said, if you actually go on their site, they do allow you to pick base recipes, and you can tweak those. And then once you get it and you actually start to set up the device, you basically can adjust the ABV and also the bitterness. However, it is really close to that automated brewery system that gets you what you want. That being said, I feel like it just would require a small software update, and they could just allow that. So maybe if we're lucky and there's enough demand for it, either they'll upgrade the software at some point, or maybe their next device will be more appealing to that. Outside of the actual brewing system, this device has a sous vide built into it, which is pretty entertaining because my brew in the brag process actually used a portable sous vide to both stir and retain the temperature of a brewer. So it just seems kind of logical that they reverse it in this order here. One of the biggest gripes most of us homebrewers have comes down to the sanitization process. It's not the fact that you have to sanitize everything. That's pretty obvious. If you're going to consume things, it should be clean. With sanitizing the beer process, you basically have to put Star San in a bunch of things, soak everything, and that means if you're going to be bottling beer, you're sanitizing every single one of those. It just takes a long time, and it's a pain in the ass. And then you also have to buy things like a beer drying rack, or you can stick it in a dishwasher, but that really doesn't sound all that sanitary to me. Whatever. Basically what I'm getting at here is the Pico C, it handles all the heavy lifting for you. For the first bit, you're going to be doing a rinse cycle, and really it's only like 10 minutes of hand-on, and the rest of it just handles on its own. And then post-brew, where your keg is actually now changed from wort to beer, it's just not carbonated, you're of course going to have to rinse out that keg and then scrub out the extra goo that's in there. But otherwise, it handles everything. To me, that's just like mind-blowing how beneficial that part of the entire system is. But with the Pico C, really, you're probably only doing about 20 minutes of cleaning yourself, and then the rest of the time that's involved, and there is quite a bit of time, it does go through like hour-long cycles for rinsing and all that stuff. It handles all of it on its own. So, yay, that's just great. As far as the brewing process goes, I'm not going to get too involved here because, well, it only takes about 10 minutes. After you've put some distilled water in the top of the machine, you put the Pico pack, which is the all-grain compartment, and the hops compartment inside the step filter. You stick it in the machine, connect some hoses up to the keg, and press the button a few times. The thing just kind of takes it from there and does the rest. That's it. That's the homebrewing process. In fact, if you want, you can actually look on the full review. It'll show you step by step that process. But I basically just told you what it is. It takes 10 minutes, and then it does the rest of it for about an hour and a half to almost 3 hours, depending on what beer you're brewing. One of the cool things about the Pico C is that if you actually go and connect the device to the website, you can log in and then actually track the progress through the brew cycle. So when it's doing that, you'll be able to see things like the temperature and the brew time and basically how long you have left. So that's one of the reasons why it's a little bit disappointing that you sort of have that governor on there where you can't change the boil times or temperatures, because it's right there and that data is very interesting and it definitely affects the overall outcome of beer. So, whatever, but it is still very neat that you're able to monitor it. Now, while we're actually speaking about monitoring the beer, there's a few other things that are worth noting here. So if you're like me and you homebrew, basically you put the finished wort into a carboy or maybe into your bucket, depending on what setup you have, and then you basically leave it there after you've timed it. Some of us use apps, some of us just put a reminder to check on it. Other times you're going to have to put things like additional hops in there, or you're going to switch it to a secondary. Whatever your system is here, the Pico C actually has all of that covered for you. So again, with their website, it'll remind you when you brewed it and it's completed. So if you have to add in additional hops, that's kind of on you, but it will give you an indicator of exactly when you should be ready to start kegging it, and then decide if you want to force carb it or you want to bottle condition it. So with your keg, this is where actually your wort's going to be sitting. If you can see on here, there's a temporary decal which has the temperature gauge on it. So it's not just your temperature gauge. it actually includes information that'll say either it's going to be on a standard fermentation cycle or on a quicker fermentation cycle, depending on basically where you're storing this. So obviously faster means it's going to take less time to ferment, standard, a little bit longer. So that is absolutely one way to do it, and it will give you a pretty accurate representation of when your wort has basically turned into uncarbonated beer. However, one of the other cool things that we get to play with, and this is actually in beta and will be out in January, is called the PicoFerm. On top of the actual keg there, you basically have a port that acts as your airlock. So on top of the airlock, you'll basically just put the PicoFerm on top of it, and then once you have pitched your yeast, this will be connecting to the website. You go into the website, you tell it to start tracking it, and from there it'll just start checking both the pressure within the keg and also the temperature. So basically the PicoFerm uses that proprietary information to in turn tell you when that wort is now beer, which in turn means you're ready to put it into the serving keg. So of course this is an accessory, it's an add-on, you're gonna have to pay a little bit more. So at $60, this really isn't that bad of a price point for something that's going to give you better tasting beer, or in theory it should. That being said, there are other devices on the market for typical homebrewing setups, but those in itself cost quite a bit more. They're anywhere from $100 to $200+. For the most part, those just use some very ugly user interfaces. This is a very simple one. It uses 3 different lights to indicate if it's working, if it's in progress, or if there's an error. Basically, once you're told that it's ready, you can either stick it in the keg and let it sit for a little bit longer, or you're ready to stick it into the serving keg and find a way to carbonate it. So just like the brewing process, the kegging process is actually, you know what? No, it's easier than the brewing process, which only takes 10 minutes. This takes even less time because really all you're doing is following a few steps on the Pico C, putting a tube inside here, and then it does the rest. If you're doing this by hand with the homebrewing process, I will tell you it's definitely a mess. And not only that, you might be bothering the trub and the gross stuff that's floating around in there. Both batches that I made did not have that issue even once. In fact, the clarity that came from the beer from the Pico C is just kind of mind-blowing to me. There's not necessarily a filter on it. There's sort of a little bit of a filter inside of that keg once you're transferring it into here, and it kind of gets rid of some of that. But there is no filter, but there's no sediment in the beer. It just looks fantastic. That's what blows my mind the most. That being said, the kegging process, super simple. And at that point, basically, you can either do a forced carbonation or you can do the bottle conditioning. So that's where you basically just take the sugar, stick it in here. It'll take another 2 weeks, so that does elongate the process. Now, if you want your beer even faster, you can just force carbonate the beer. Now, personally, during the homebrewing process, I've never carbonated the beer just because the kegging setup that you typically need is something that takes up a great deal of space. You also usually need a refrigerator for those kegs after they've been completed, and I was not going to deal with that. With this, you can actually see how small that is. That's a little CO2 regulator, and it uses a little CO2 cartridge like you use in a bicycle tire pump, and that's it. You basically put it in there, it starts to release CO2, and then over 36 hours it just becomes carbonated and you're good to go. So I had a little bit of struggle on the first 2 times with it just because I wasn't quite sure how to get it up and running, but after that it worked fantastic. Now the instructions aren't super clear, but over those 36 hours it kind of makes the assumption that it looks like you only need the 1 cartridge. However, I've used 2 per session just to make sure that it's carbonated, and it has worked out. So would I recommend the Pico C? That is actually a little bit of a head scratcher for me. So I personally have been a home brewer for about the last 10 years, actually a little bit more than that, which means that I've invested financially into the hobby. I've got a lot of different equipment, and that means I can brew quite a bit of different ways, and I can of course tweak things as I want. Now with this at about $450, technically the full price at $550, you're getting a machine that does all the heavy lifting. So for me personally, I'm at the stage where basically recipe creation is the next step into the hobby. It's where you get to tweak it fully, and that unfortunately means that I need to be able to adjust the temperature and the boil times on this. That being said, if they just unleash the governor on this would just be a total dream. However, for anyone else, especially if you're kind of in that extract stage or just kind of interested in beer in general, or maybe you have a startup office, or you just have an office that you want some fresh beer in, this is totally worth it. It's a really simple thing. It makes your entire area smell like fantastic beer as it's brewing, and for some people that's a little bit of an acquired sense. That being said, it works really well. It does all the terrible things that I never want to do with homebrewing, which is the cleaning and sanitization process. And if you look, that beer is just simply clean and crisp. I mean, I've brewed some terrible beer, I'm not gonna lie. I've of course fruited beer too, and I will never do that again. But this, it's just got lacing, it's perfect. That's what you want from a beer, especially a homebrew. And with there not really being a filter on here, this is something that you can properly serve to friends and they won't go, ew, what is this gross weird stuff sitting at the bottom? That happens every time you make homebrew. That being said, it does feel a little bit like it's against how hobbies typically work because it sort of does it all for you. But that being said, I see this really as something that you can really use as a test subject for different recipes. So PicoBrew. Release software, make it fully customizable, and I'm pretty sure we would give this an absolutely perfect score. That being said, again, this is just a really fun device. It is kind of an interesting way to get you a different look at how the beer brewing process works, but it won't truly give you that insight and education into the beer brewing process. Again, we totally recommend it. We think it's fantastic. I just see a couple of downsides with the locking out of full customizations, but it works great and it does produce really good beer. So that's it. That's it for the rest of the year. See you guys in 2018. Homebrewing, it's not quite the same. And with millennials, of course, we like, fuck it, give up on this stupid millennial joke. It's not good. So yes, this is Elliot. This is Pugloaf. This is terrible spilling beer.